the H20s were really, are really seventh tier GPUs. I think one of the president's advisors called them fourth tier, but they're pretty downgraded. They're pretty optimized for things like inference, for running AI applications, but not at all for training. And so I think the criticism from some quarters that this is going to hand China some sort of a major advantage in AI are not really accurate. And there's been a lot of confusion around the nature of these H20s and why the president is doing this. But in this case, he's been very impressed with the arguments of Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang and also his AI czar, if you will, David Sachs, who both argue that the U.S. should allow China to acquire these semiconductors, in part to avoid further erosion of U.S. position in the China market, of U.S. company position, and have Chinese companies turn to domestic alternatives from Huawei, as you mentioned.
Paul, confusion is the operative word here, isn't it? Didn't DeepSeek demonstrate how China is making more progress than conventional wisdom thought would have us believe, despite the chip export restrictions? And maybe that's a function of Nvidia and other US chips finding a backdoor to China, or maybe it's a function of China's efforts to scale domestic capability in advanced chip manufacturing off their own. So isn't this new US strategy something of an own goal, and doesn't it ultimately yield China a competitive advantage?
Well, it's a complicated issue. It's a great question. Look, we're in the middle of a situation where Chinese companies still prefer to use Nvidia GPUs because of the overall software development environment, and just because developers in China are used to using these. At the same time, Huawei and its Ascend series of processors, for example, is trying to make inroads into those the Chinese companies and sell them more GPUs. But Chinese companies are reluctant to buy those Huawei Ascends, in part just because it's difficult to transfer all their know-how and their development skills to a new set of hardware and a new set of software libraries, for example, that support the development of AI models. So the H20s, in some sense, provide a sort of bridge for China and for Chinese companies, in part because, as you mentioned, DeepSeek, which came out in January with some very capable models, is now being adopted, particularly for inference in China by many companies, as AI uptake in Chinese enterprises is increasing. I was in China just last month and was very impressed with the types of applications that Chinese companies are using AI for, and this has all increased the need for inference. But when it comes to training, this is the confusion, I think, around some of these issues. Training is what's really required to develop more advanced models, more advanced capabilities, and the H20 is not suited for that. And DeepSeek, as you noted, trained its models on Nvidia hardware that it obtained legally after October 2022, when the U.S. first imposed export controls on GPUs. And again, Nvidia modified its GPUs to be compliant with U.S. export controls. Many Chinese companies, including DeepSeek and Alibaba and Tencent, all the leading AI model developers acquired those Nvidia GPUs legally at the time and are still able to use those to train their models. So we're in sort of a transition point between Chinese companies running out of those stockpiles of earlier acquired Nvidia GPUs and hoping that Huawei's new Ascend series of processors will be capable of replacing those. But they are not quite capable of doing that yet. Probably next year, Huawei will have a new version of its 910 series of processors that will be more competitive with Nvidia. But the H20s are sort of muddling the waters here a little bit, muddying the waters because there's so much attention to them, but they're really only going to be used in China for inference, and that's for deploying models and running them at enterprises and for consumer applications.
Interesting. It's on balance then, Paul, who's got the best tech, who's got the edge, and who's ahead in this global AI race?
Well, the U.S. companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI are still the leaders. These are all mostly proprietary models, keep in mind. And they're definitely the leaders globally. They have a lot of compute access. They have hundreds of thousands of the most advanced NVIDIA GPUs, the GB200s, for example. And so they're leading in terms of the sort of absolute capability of these models. But the top 4 of the top 5 open source or open weight models globally are from Chinese companies, including DeepSeek and Alibaba. And so Chinese companies are arguably leading in terms of open source, open weight models, which many companies are taking up because they're cheaper to run. But in terms of sort of raw compute power and sort of the most advanced and capable models, that's still the province of U.S. companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, and xAI. But Chinese companies are becoming better at all these at all the aspects of model development, and they're innovating, as we saw with DeepSeek earlier this year. And we're expecting DeepSeek's next model, the V4 base model and the R2 reasoning model, to come out soon. And that will be a huge milestone here in terms of this competition and show where China is and Chinese companies are in terms of model development and capabilities.
Paul, what do you make about this 15% cut, if you will, of China chip revenue that Washington wants to secure from Nvidia and AMD? Highly unusual policy. It sounds like it's a tax on doing business in China and with China. But importantly, doesn't that undercut or undermine the entire basis of this policy of controlling strategic sectors in the first place, like advanced semiconductor chips, from getting into Chinese hands? And now it's all right if Washington gets a cut.
Well, that's a great question. And again, we don't really know the full details of this arrangement that the president alluded to today. Again, it is very unprecedented for the U.S. government to sort of take a cut to approve licenses, for example, based on getting a cut of revenues for sales to China. So we don't really know how broadly this kind of policy might be extended. Right now, it appears to be limited to these the H20s, which the president said he would approve. He said they're obsolete, as you noted in the earlier clip. And so I think it's kind of a novel approach to this whole problem, and it's raising a lot of eyebrows, frankly, in Washington, particularly among national security types. But we don't know how important this is going to be going forward. The other issue that the president raised today in your clip, which I think is more important, is the willingness of the administration to approve other more advanced GPUs for export to China. Now, keep in mind, as the president noted, if new GPUs based on the Blackwell architecture, for example, which would be downgraded to some level of performance that would be determined by the Commerce Department, if those were approved, that would be a big deal going forward. Although, again, that the idea here is to sort of addict China to substandard or non-cutting edge technology via
this is what I find entirely confusing. I mean, the Chinese leadership is not stupid. They're not going to be fobbed off by what appears to be second fiddle technology. So
no,
how
absolutely.
Is this going to be
already
feasible?
the Cyberspace Administration of China has called in Nvidia to ask about, for example, the potential for the monitoring of these GPU exports to China that has been called for example, in Congress. And then others in the Chinese system, including the state media, has been very critical of the U.S. effort to export the H20 and other sort of downgraded GPUs to China. So yes, this issue is, as you say, is confusing on both sides, and there are opponents on both sides of this issue. And I think we're sort of in uncharted waters here in terms of how far the administration is willing to go. Under the Biden administration, we had a very clear policy of tightening up these controls. And in the Trump era, we're sort of a little bit at sea in terms of what the ultimate policy will be and how far the administration is willing to go with these issues like buybacks or cuts of sales to China from large companies like Nvidia.
Still a work in progress, a whip, as my old editor used to say. How and where does TSMC, Paul, and Taiwan's Silicon Shield and the geopolitics fit into this landscape? And how essential is it now to US strategy that TSMC, to all intents and purposes, appears to be aligned, is on side, building manufacturing in Arizona, exempting it from 100% tariffs, potentially?
Great, great question. Great question. And remember, the idea with TSMC and attracting them to Arizona was to reduce this heavy dependence that U.S. companies face in terms of manufacturing advanced GPUs. So Taiwan and TSMC account for roughly 90% of the most advanced semiconductors production globally. And so right now in Arizona, they're starting to ramp up production based on those the two fabs that are being built in Arizona. And eventually that will be a fairly large gigafab. But this is only going to cut that dependence on Taiwan and TSMC by a small percentage, single-digit percentage of overall production. So the vast majority of capacity for producing these GPUs that are produced for Nvidia and AMD and other companies will remain on Taiwan. So it's not insignificant amount of production in the U.S., but it's going to take time to ramp that up. There's also the issue of advanced packaging. Apparently, TSMC has also now agreed to site an advanced packaging facility in Arizona. But right now, guess what? They're going to have to ship those GPUs for the time being that they manufacture in Arizona back to Taiwan for packaging. And so that doesn't really get to the issue of reducing dependence on Taiwan. So for the foreseeable future, at least out to 2030, we're going to be heavily dependent. The U.S. companies are going to continue to be heavily dependent on TSMC and Taiwan. And as you noted, yes, this issue of the sort of silicon shield around Taiwan is a complicated one. I believe it's been eroded to some degree by the export controls that have also cut off Chinese companies, for example, from using TSMC to manufacture their designs. And so the incentives in Beijing around Taiwan are changing with respect to how to think about the issue of advanced semiconductor manufacturing as China becomes less capable of using TSMC as a manufacturing base. And so this problem is going to be, it made worse, I think, if the U.S. decides to ratchet up export controls. And so this H20 issue is interesting, and it looks like the Trump administration, in order to get a trade deal that you mentioned early on, Shrai, is trying to at least promise, and has promised, no more major export controls until we see what kind of a trade deal can be worked out in November.